Sorry, we got two half invalids, so between us we are full. Who is here for the first time? Hands up. Oh, well, please come back. You see from the list, we've got lots of people. Next week we've got Nicholas Parsons, who's 93. I hope he makes it. The Duke of Marlborough, then Julian Fellows, and Maria Testino, and Kirsty Young. So, best kept secret in London for £6 or whatever it is. What happens is that I have a conversation with our guest, and our guests are always people who have led extraordinary lives, and then I'm going to let you, the audience, ask him questions, because the whole point of these forums is for you, the general public, to interact with our star. And the only proviso is that you've got to ask intelligent questions. Otherwise, you'll be passed over, and I will call you a bit of a bore or a stupid man, woman, whatever. Now, Andrew, you have probably interviewed more famous people than anybody else, except perhaps Michael Parkinson, if you added up all the lives that all the years before he had before you. Do you find, as I do, that when you have a binary question, and I hear you every Sunday asking binary questions, namely yes or no being the answer to, aren't you irritated that 99% of your interviewees never answer in the yes or the no?
To give you a binary answer, yes. And to go on often infuriated, but to try and pin somebody down, very often you have to give them a question which A, they clearly know the answer to, and B, they'll look foolish not giving you a binary answer. So, David Davies, did you say 6 months ago that if we left the European Union, this would happen? Very hard for him to then avoid the question, and so on. So you use the binary questions to dig into where you're really
So what did
going.
they say? What did he say?
Well, he's next week. I hope.
So will you entertain us? Are you having him on Sunday or the Sunday week?
He's coming in on Sunday.
So will you ask him that question?
I've got a whole series of things.
Yeah, but we really want you to ask him that first question, and all of us will be watching you and see how he answers. I mean, they always start off by saying, well, before I answer that, and then they think we're stupid to have forgotten it within 3 minutes, and we're not stupid. You press, and they still go on. What do you do? I mean,
so this is a very interesting tactical dilemma which we all face. If I was Jeremy Paxman, I'd just get redder and redder and angrier and stab the air. My technique is different because you have to, on television, play to your own personality, and I'm not like that. So the best I do is you ask the question once, twice, you remind them what the question is, ask it thrice, and then, if necessary, say, well, it was a clear question, everybody watching understands that you haven't answered that question, so let's move on. And then if it happens again, and a third time that they haven't answered the question, they feel they're in trouble, and then you might start to get some answers.
why didn't you say on the third occasion, are you St. Peter? And they say, what? Well, he denied Christ 3 times. At least he said no. Can't you say no or yes?
I could try. That's a very good idea. I'll try that one.
We'll try that. Okay, we're going to watch you this Sunday. St. Peter being your lead. Now, look, I mean, I think that, of course, you're famous for your being the interviewer. And every Sunday, everybody sits up in bed, as I do with my wife, with our cup of coffee. At about 8:50, we say, right, let's make a cup of tea and watch Andrew Marr. And you become a national treasure, as it were. And tell me, what do you do on a Saturday? What's your Saturday like? Tell us exactly what happens. What time do you get up? When do you do your briefs? What time are you at the BBC? In that wonderful scooter or car, which you don't have anymore. It's rather sad to see that you're worming your way through the corridors in a car. But tell us your program on a Saturday?
So Saturday is the day for the real briefings. I have a crucial meeting at about 2 o'clock in Broadcasting House where I sit down with my editor and he plays the person that I'm going to interview and is as boring and obstructive as possible and deviates and blocks and fustigates in every possible way so that I am prepared for that. And I try and bang into my head the order of questions, where we're trying to go. So with David Davis, I'm already thinking there's a lot of big Brexit questions to ask, but we also want to know what's really going on inside number 10 with Theresa May. How do I possibly get David to a place where he might start to talk about that? What's the way in? And so we're thinking tactics and strategy, and we're banging our way through these interviews. That's the crucial part of the day. And then in the evenings, I hit Chinatown and drink until very late.
Now, but what time do you go to bed on the Saturday?
I go to bed early. I go to bed at about 9 or 10 o'clock on a Saturday because I'm up at 5.
But how do you, but you don't normally go to bed at 9 o'clock, presumably, during the week. So how do you make yourself go to bed at 9 o'clock on the Saturday?
I find a very, very large Lefroy whiskey, 50-50 with water and a lot of water at the appropriate time. A little bit of classical music on to soothe me, and then I go to bed.
What time do you wake up?
5 o'clock.
So 5 o'clock, and then you get dressed. It takes you about an hour, I gather.
It takes me, to get dressed, yes, probably. I'm a slow dresser. And then a car picks me up outside the house at about 5:40. I'm in the office at about 6 o'clock. And then weird things like makeup and getting all the wires and the accoutrements stuck on take a bit of time. And then I read all the papers from the start to finish, all the serious papers. I don't bother with the pops anymore. I read the serious papers, go back through the briefings, back through the interviews, check the scripts, do the top of the program, and brief the paper reviewers. And that really takes me pretty relentlessly until we're on air at 9 o'clock. Then it goes like a flash, and then it's 10 o'clock, and we have breakfast with the guests.
Afterwards?
Afterwards, yes.
Do people stay?
They mostly stay. It's very interesting. If it's been a really difficult interview, quite often they leave. The one that sticks in my mind most was when Theresa May was Home Secretary, and we'd been trying to bully her to come into the studio for a long time, and she was very reluctant because she said she went to church and she wouldn't do it. She eventually agreed to come in, and we then had quite a cantankerous interview about immigration. And at the end of it, when we'd finished, I said, I hope you're going to stay for breakfast. She said, oh, I don't think so. And I said, oh, please stay for breakfast. And so she stayed for breakfast, slightly crossly. And she was sitting opposite me across the table. And I said, would you like some coffee, Home Secretary? She said, yes, I'll have some coffee. So I poured her some coffee. And then I said, would you like some milk with that coffee, Home Secretary? And she was wearing a shot silk trouser suit, which had cost a lot of money, was absolutely brand new. And I leaned over for the milk jug, and I just clipped the top of the milk jug, and I soaked her in ice-cold milk from nipples to knees.
Well, thank God it wasn't the coffee.
And she was not very happy.
I've always thought that she always carried quite a lot of cleavage in Parliament. I mean, do you think did she turn up in a sort of cleavage outfit at your interview?
Not on my show after that, certainly. No, she was. It was a very sort of soigné, very elegant trouser suit. And one of my other guests that day was the Labour peer, Helena Kennedy, Baroness Kennedy. And when Theresa May was contemplating the ruin of her outfit and really, really quite upset, Helena leaned in and said, Andrew, that cost many, many £1,000 and it's brand new, isn't it, Theresa? And Theresa went, she said, and it's never going to be the same again, will it? And she went,
she famously wears these green leather trousers designed by Amanda Wakely. I thought they were rather unfetching. What do you think? Perhaps that's because she fears that you might pour coffee over it and the leather would make it porous.
I think she'll be in a high-vis vest next time she comes on.
Is she a robot?
No, she's not. I tell you what she is. I think she's a perfectly decent, serious, hard-working woman who is almost cripplingly shy. Very unusual in public life. I think she finds meeting a group of people she hasn't known before without there being a set series of questions and answers almost intolerable. So that was why, I think to everyone's surprise, she was quite such a bad campaigner during the election campaign. It wasn't entirely that she refuses to answer questions, or that she hates answering questions, or that she can't answer questions. And indeed, in a very small group, as with eventually the survivors of the Grenfell Tower, she can be warm and humane and cry and hug people and do all the things that Jeremy Corbyn does so effectively in public in front of the cameras. She just hates it. She absolutely hates it. To that extent, she's a very old-fashioned politician, and the world, for better or worse, that we now inhabit doesn't like that kind of reticence anymore.
But don't you think that politicians generally are rather awkward with pressing flesh? I mean, during hustings, they do it reluctantly. Whereas if you watched the Queen, for example, no matter how grand she is, and she's the grandest person in the world, she, however, I think, has a common touch that Kipling would not have been shied from, and is natural to her. But as you said, somebody like Theresa May and other politicians, they are not used to embracing the public, except for people like Jeremy Corbyn, who brings the common man, you know, Mabel, or his questions, Prime Minister Times has turned it into a sort of vernacular reflection of society. And therefore, don't you think that politics is changing dramatically, as we saw in the last election, with the turnout of the younger people to whom Corbyn related, that politicians need to start thinking about talking in a simpler and straighter language?
I think that's right, and I think it's partly due to the technology. In the age of Lloyd George or Gladstone or indeed Winston Churchill, those politicians would meet members of the public in rooms like this, and they'd be on a platform and they'd make a speech, and they'd be heckled and they'd be shouted at, and they'd have to be able to reply and give responses and win the audience over. But these days, the real danger for the politician is you bump into somebody who is a nurse, who is at a food bank, whatever it might be, and they go for the politician in very direct terms, and the cameras are watching, and what would have been a very insignificant, small meeting with the public becomes a massive, massive story because it is broadcast so widely. So they're constantly worried about whether the person they're about to meet has an agenda, is very angry, is going to say something memorable to them that will be all over the evening news. That's the problem that they face now.
Well, even worse, when people are caught in flagrante delicto, like Gordon Brown mumbling behind that...
bigoted woman.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that was a disaster.
Absolutely.
Do you think that he was a bit of a robot?
Gordon, well, again, Gordon never liked normal conversation. He's a very, very intellectual, again, a bit like Theresa May, a very old-fashioned politician. I can remember there was a very relatively obscure American sociologist of a conservative disposition called Gertrude Himmelfarb, who wrote pamphlets about work and welfare and so forth. And I can remember being sent to interview Gordon Brown just after the failed coup against Tony Blair. If you remember, Tom Watson had been found at Gordon's house up in Scotland, and everybody realized that Gordon was himself deliberately plotting against Tony Blair, trying to get him out as Prime Minister. It was a very, very tense moment, and I went up to Scotland to interview him, and I could see him. We talked outside. I could see him striding up and down on the lawn a few yards away, glowering, talking to his advisors, and he suddenly pulled me over, and I thought, here we go, he's going to tell me what the questions I'm not allowed to ask, or try to. And he came, Andrew, he said, have you read the latest pamphlet by Gertrude Himmelfarb yet? And I thought, this is a very, very strange man. So he liked to immerse himself in philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment and obscure economists, and he really thought that was the level at which all political discourse should be conducted, except, of course, for the stabbing of good colleagues and friends in the back from time to time, which is also necessary.
Well, which meant that he was rather contemptuous of Tony Blair, who he obviously didn't rate intellectually.
He didn't. He thought Tony Blair was shallow and cheap and didn't understand for a second why Tony Blair had become Prime Minister, and he hadn't, and he thought this was just a complete failure of...
Did they have a deal?
Yes, they did have a deal. And did Tony Blair welch on it? Yes, he did a bit, because Tony Blair did agree that he was going to stand down after a certain period of time, and Gordon would get his chance. But in office, Apart from the Iraq War episode, Tony Blair really felt that he was a very good Prime Minister and everything was working very well. And the more he saw Gordon and Gordon's temper and Gordon's briefings and so forth, the more he felt this is not somebody who is fit to be Prime Minister. Therefore, I'm just going to hang on. And Gordon got angrier and angrier and behaved worse and worse. And Tony became more and more determined until the whole House of Cards finally collapsed.
But finally, without dwelling too much on the politics, but I mean, surely Tony Blair was a precursor of the vernacular to Corbyn in a way, because he popularized the way in which language was spoken through that ghastly Alistair Campbell. Why don't Conservatives pay attention to that? And that was talking about 20 years ago. But they still speak in a rather pompous way. I mean, whenever Conservative ministers come onto your show, they talk as if they're still Winston Churchill and so forth. I mean, why don't they learn?
Well, that's a very good way. And even the allegedly popular ones have got a Churchill complex. Boris Johnson is convinced that he is the reincarnation, not of an Olive, but of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill got away with making very, very good jokes and being allegedly on the wrong side of history, and eventually his country called him back. And really, almost all of politics has got the backdrop of a kind of squelching sound of Boris trampling around the undergrowth, waiting to be summoned back by his country. But Boris thinks that Latin tags and so forth are what the people of Britain really respond to now, and he may be a little out of date. I think one of the most interesting things about the last election campaign is how the left, and in particular the Corbynite momentum left, used memes and jokes and little films on social media to devastating effect. And there is almost nobody on the Conservative side who's got the faintest clue about how to respond to this. They're really worried about it.
Personally, not the BBC view, obviously, what chances would you give Boris Johnson being the next Prime Minister?
I'm slightly bearish about that. I think it's way below 50-50. The dilemma for there's two dilemmas for the Tories. First of all, I would say that trying to have another leadership contest now would be an act of such suicidal, catastrophic self-indulgence, just as we're going into these Brexit talks, that the Conservative Party will not go along that way. If you get rid of May, you have a leadership contest. The entire Brexit process then goes on hold for, another 2 months or so, because the Europeans have no idea what Prime Minister they're going to be dealing with, and whether the new Prime Minister will have any authority at all. If the new Prime Minister is to have any authority at all, there probably has to be yet another general election. So you're setting off a series which, looking at the polls at the moment, Jeremy Corbyn would win. So you're setting off a series of explosions if you try and get Theresa May out now. I think the Tory party is too shrewd to go down that path, but you never know. But the second thing is, if you get rid of Theresa May, then who takes over? And the dilemma is, if the Tories want the most cheering up, kind of gregarious, we all have a smile on our face when we see him leader, to take on Jeremy Corbyn, then that is clearly Boris. If the Conservatives want a leader who is seen outside Britain as a serious guy who can hold the Tory party together, deliver Brexit, then it's not Boris, it's David Davis. So they have a big dilemma. But you can't resolve these dilemmas in public, right in the middle of the most important negotiations Britain has had since the Second World War. You just can't do it.
Let's go back a bit. When you were 8 years old, you wrote to the Chinese embassy because you thought that communism was the way forward. And precociously, you said that you wanted some literature, and you were sent, in fact, a whole box of Mao little red books.
I was.
Tell us about what you did with them.
Well, I distributed them vigorously around my school fellows and teachers. I was at a very, very small, rather brutal, primitive Scottish boarding school. And I wrote to the Chinese embassy saying that I had set up a cell of the Chinese Communist Party in my school, and that I required regular literature, including the Little Red Book. They sent me lots of Little Red Books in the plastic covers. and also many copies of a magazine called China Reconstructs. And all I can remember from China Reconstructs was a picture of a peasant in a field with a pistol, alleged to be shooting down an American spy plane. And even then I thought it was unlikely that. But no, I always wonder what happened in the embassy. Did they really think that there was a little interesting cell of Scottish schoolboys working away to achieve Chinese-style communism?
Well, did they continue to contact you?
They did for quite a while. I got letters, I got magazines, I got literature, and then it kind of tailed away. They realized that whatever was happening, it wasn't a revolutionary situation in Fife.
Have you told the Chinese ambassador about this?
I haven't actually yet. I should.
Well, you should. I mean, he's a supreme communist. I mean, that story demonstrated to me that you were very sensitive about politics at a very early age. I mean, 8 years old, God forbid. I mean, I can't even remember how to spell the word communist when I was 8, and I'm Chinese. I want to go forward to your career because, first and foremost, you became a journalist and became editor of The Independent. But your tenure at The Independent was not a very happy one. It was a rather checkered one. And if you remember, I'm sure you were sort of sacked, I think possibly by Alistair Campbell sneaking on you. And then you were brought back when Tony O'Reilly bought it, and then you didn't really last. Tell us, was it a very happy encounter with that newspaper?
I loved The Independent. It was the happiest time of my life when I first joined it and it had first started. It was like a huge, unusual adventure in journalism, setting up a new, serious, unaligned newspaper on which the journalists had a real chance to influence the editorial line, and it was wonderful, the happiest days of my life. My period as editor was the most catastrophic period of my life, professionally. The truth is that I wasn't a very good editor, first of all, I should say. But I think I'm also the only ever national newspaper editor to be sacked from the same job twice. I was sacked, defenestrated, refenestrated, and then sacked again. The Alistair Campbell story was that very early on in Tony Blair's period as Labour leader, before he had become Prime Minister, he went around the various papers telling us about his European policy. And he told The Independent that he was going to join the Euro. And then a few weeks later, he went off to see Rupert Murdoch, and then wrote a piece for the Sun newspaper promising, in quotes, on St. George's Day to slay the dragon of Euro-federalism. And I thought this was such a cynical about-turn that I lost my temper, stupidly, stupid youth that I was, and I phoned up Tony Blair, and he was in the back of a car with Alistair Campbell. And I kind of ranted at both of them and said this was betrayal, and if they thought they could say one thing to one newspaper and something else to another newspaper, then they were heading off in a disastrous direction. I think I was right about that, actually. But anyway, shortly afterwards, the then sort of boss of the newspaper, David Montgomery, in charge of the Mirror Group in those days, no great fan or friend of mine, came into my office with a kind of mirthless grin on his face, chuckling away, and said he'd just been told to fire me. And I said, really? He said, yes, Alistair Campbell's been on the phone, and he says you've gone mad, and you're clinically insane, and it would be a dereliction of duty not to have you out immediately. Yes. Anyway, he didn't fire me at that stage. He waited for a while, and then he fired me.
And then you were fired again
yes,
after.
Then I was fired again.
You were reinstated by Tony O'Reilly, who admired you. And so why were you fired a second time?
Well, I had two newspaper groups owned The Independent, more or less 50% of the shareholding, 48.9% of the shareholding each. So they had the same say, but they had a totally different view of what the newspaper should be. The Trinity Mirror side of the shareholding wanted a tabloid, Green Party aligned paper for yuppies, a very strange concept. And Tony O'Reilly wanted a very, very serious, broadsheet, pro-European newspaper. And the only thing they could agree on was that they thought trying to find out how few journalists you could employ while still producing a national newspaper was a fun and exciting project. And so to try to force them to invest in the newspaper, I radically redesigned it, a completely radical redesign, on the basis that this was kamikaze suicidal behavior unless they then put a lot of money into advertising the new newspaper. And of course, I redesigned the newspaper. I don't know if any of you remember the catastrophic experiment that was called New Coke, when Coca Cola changed the recipe overnight and announced it, and sales plummeted and the CEO had to leave. Well, Tony O'Reilly, who started his career in business running Kerrygold butter, knew more about the food and drink industry than anybody else I came across. So when I came over to him and I presented the new designs of the newspaper, I laid them out on the floor, and he was sitting there in his dressing gown. He looked down at them, he said, "I tell you what, Andrew," he said, "I like this. I think it's bold, I think it's exciting, I think it's experimental, and I'm very, very excited about it." And I thought, yes. And then there was a short pause. He said, "On the other hand, Andrew, I thought all of those things about New Coke." And I thought, that is the nicest way of being told I have screwed up I have ever come across.
Then you went on to the BBC. I'm just trying to trace your career a bit, where you became the political editor and so forth. So you've gone sort of print to media. Did you like that change, or were you excited by the prospect of going into another medium, having done newspaper and radio and now television?
Well, I had always thought I looked so odd that I had no future on television at all, and that therefore it would be a very brief experience, but it was actually it was a huge fun. I've been writing a lot of columns for the last 10 or 15 years, and I've become really, really bored by my own opinions. It was time to do something else, and I loved the fact that I had to be neutral on BBC. I loved the challenges of the new technology, and that business of suddenly standing somewhere and looking at a camera and in live time addressing 6 million people without faltering and telling them the one thing they really needed to know about whatever had happened in politics. There is no harder intellectual job in journalism than taking a complicated story and boiling it down, reducing it to 3 or 4 sentences of vivid, memorable prose and telling people what they needed. So it was a really, really tough job, and I loved it.
So it wasn't your face?
The face people got used to and got coped with.
And then, in fact, you did more, because other than being a presenter, you went on to make several series. I mean, you know, the history of the world, for example, and the history of Britain and so forth. You made many of these things. So you progressed from being a journalist to a presenter. And was that phase also exciting for you?
Yes, it was. It was, looking back, it was too much. I can see my wife beginning to nod here. I was doing Start the Week on radio. I was doing my job as political editor, and I was herring around the world making documentaries. And I think that was partly why I had my stroke. I was just overdoing it. But it was great fun. I mean, I loved
doing the history of the world is not exactly
not a small project.
Easy. Yes, yes.
Now in Chinese, by the way.
Well, no, I mean, you did a series on China, which I didn't associate you with, except for this memorable incident of you being 8 years old writing to the Chinese embassy. But you presented it very clearly and identified that Mao was actually not the great man of modern China, but Deng Xiaoping, which I totally agreed. And you remember my friend and I invited you to lunch because we thought that was a very perceptive analysis. So we were very impressed. And quickly, onto the last 2 things that you have been doing. You wrote a novel, and then you've started painting. Now tell us about that, because that's another divergent things you have done.
Well, the novels, there are 2 in fact, and they were my attempt to carry on reporting politics in different forms, because there's lots of things about the way politics actually operates that you pick up and you understand as a journalist, but you can't really put into news stories and you can't explain in the normal way. So I wrote a novel, first of all, about what goes on inside Downing Street, about a prime minister in the middle of a European referendum who suddenly dies, and they have to hide the fact that he's died. And for how long you can persuade people that Theresa May was still in Downing Street when in fact she'd gone completely, as it were. And All I
might as well be.
all I would say about that novel is that it's about an in-out European referendum, and I predicted Brexit in that. I said it was going to happen. And the second novel, we'll wait and see, it's about a very left-wing Labour Prime Minister. And about a plot by Tony Blair and his confrère to get rid of him. They realize that they know how to run the country, but nobody will ever listen to them again after the Iraq War. And they realize the only way to get back in control is to produce, as it were, genetically modified MPs. In other words, to select the next generation of ultra-Blairite MPs, teach them everything about how to get up the greasy pole as fast as possible, how to get selected for a constituency, how to get elected, how to get on the key committees, how to become front-bench spokesman, and so forth. And so the story is about two of these super MPs, as it were, put in to get rid of the Jeremy Corbyn figure, who then, of course, fall out with each other. So that's that. And the painting is just another part of my life. It's where I go to escape from politics and just to plunge into a world of pure colour and shape. And it's what keeps me, to the extent that I am, sane. I should say one last thing just about, you've raised the question of my behaviour at 8 years old. What I should explain is, of course, that what really, really struck me about the Maoist project was that I'd read, I think accurately, that Mao had sent a lot of the professors and the teachers out into the fields to work as peasants. And from the perspective of an 8-year-old schoolboy looking at my Latin teacher and so forth, I thought this was a splendid idea, which needed to be progressed further, which may explain my early Maoism.
Good, but the painting, you have got an exhibition in Liverpool. If you like to look up Nick.
It's the Nick Cork Gallery, N-I-C, and then C-O-R-K-E Gallery in Liverpool. You can see all the paintings online.
Yeah, not nice, all right? It is a too misspelt word, right? Nick.
Cork. Cork with an E, Nick without the K, so two misspelled words. But very good photographs of the paintings.
Listen, I've transgressed my 20 minutes. It's half an hour, so let's have a question. Let's have a question. Just, yeah, wait until the microphone comes.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Good. Well, actually, I have two questions.
Stop being greedy.
So, do you think the newspaper industry is now busted flush and that there's no real future for newspapers?
You mean print form?
Print.
Yeah.
You know, we have social media and 24-hour news. And the other question is, do you think there's a role for a centrist party in the UK, as we've seen in France, the success of that party in France?
So newspapers, first of all, I think newspapers are in long-term secular decline. You look at the numbers, there's no other conclusion you can draw. And even apparently quite successful newspapers like The Guardian are running out of cash at a fast rate. And I think it won't be long before we see some more closures. However, I think there are still enough people like me who want to start the day with a cup of coffee and a physical newspaper in front of them for some to survive. I think the Times, I think the Mail, I think a few other papers will survive. I think the red top, so-called, the popular papers, because they're basically selling not news, they're selling kind of slightly sleazy entertainment. That can be done so much better online. I think they've had it. And this election showed that the old world in which the editors of the Mail, the Sun, the Telegraph, the Guardian and the Times really shaped the political debate, that world, I think, was killed off by this election. I think social media, particularly among the younger voters, was so much more influential. That's a very important moment. So secular decline, but it'll take a while. Centrist party. The problem with setting up new parties in our system, our first past the post parliamentary system, is that you'll have the Conservatives, and then you'll have the new party, you'll have the Labour Party, you'll have the Liberal Democrats, you'll have the Greens, and they will be slaughtered. First past the post systems are almost impossible to break into. The SDP came quite close and then disappeared again. It's very, very hard. So I think it's very, very difficult. The French system is completely different. Their two-stage presidential system is almost handcrafted to allow an outsider to suddenly break through. We have a totally different system. There will not be a British Macron.
Go on. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, quick.
When you have a strong political opinion about something, do you ever find it difficult to conceal that for the BBC? And also, 20 years on, what are your reflections on the handover of Hong Kong?
Right. Well, on my political opinion, I do have strong views on all sorts of things, but I always remember when I'm doing the show in particular on a Sunday morning, it's being watched by license fee payers who have every kind of opinion. They may run from UKIP to the Socialist Workers' Party and everything in between. There'll be Scottish nationalists watching, Welsh nationalists, English Southern Tories, everybody. And they've all paid their license fee, or most of them have, not Charles Moore, but everybody else. They've paid their license fee, and they have a right to an interrogator or a chair of the program, if you like, who is neutral. And so I'm trying to think that everybody is watching, and I have no right to impose my opinion. Handover of Hong Kong, I can still have this very vivid picture of Chris Patten in floods of tears with the Union flag in his hands. I think the nightmare that we all had at the moment, there will be a really, really savage and quick repression in Hong Kong, hasn't happened. And I wonder whether that little kind of festering nodule of democracy inside the People's Republic will have a good effect there. I think things have gone much better in Hong Kong than we dared believe at the time. It was, of course, a very sad moment, the end of another part of the British Empire, a long story. Those are my brief reflections on that. Yeah.
If you want to know, I've done a self-promotion here, interview with John Simpson, which you might be able to hear on Sunday on the BBC. But on your political views, surely everybody knows that the BBC is very biased already. Not you, but I mean it is completely left-wing, politically correct.
And it's very, very interesting. Not a week goes by without me being attacked in vociferous and repeated terms for being both extremely left-wing and extremely right-wing. I'm told I'm a Tory shill, I'm told I'm a communist, day after day after day.
Definitely a communist. Question.
Yes, I'm intrigued by your answer to this question, given your history with Alistair Campbell, but I wondered what your view of the wonderful BBC programme, The Thick of It, and how that reflected the politics at the time.
The Thick of It is remarkably accurate. The swearing's just as bad in real life, possibly worse. I mean, you take the story of Fiona Hill, who was Theresa May's henchwoman, until she was fired for the second time. And, you know, that very famous text she sent to Bolton of Sky News when he had reflected on air about Theresa May perhaps being too ill to carry on as Prime Minister. And she basically said, right, Bunter, you're in effing trouble. Any more of that and you're a dead man. That is straight out of Thick of It. The behaviour, which seems so extreme in comedy terms, is exactly like that in day-to-day terms.
What guidance or advice would you give to people in moment of chaos? Like, you can't think your way out. You don't know to feel left or feel right. You can't trust your instincts.
It's a very good question. My advice would be breathe out, stand back, and think historically. Actually, if you're looking at this particular period in our politics, and I think this Parliament that has just started is probably the most fragile and worrying and dangerous period in parliamentary politics in my lifetime, and possibly since the Second World War. The way to think about it is to think about the historical parallels. How does it relate to the Suez Crisis in 1956? How does it relate to the collapse of the Labour government in the 1970s? Think about that, and that gives you the kind of perspective you might need to think your way forward now.
I used to work for Reuters before it became Thomson Reuters. I asked an editor what's the first duty of a news organisation, and he cynically told me to make a profit. What do you believe is the first duty of a news organisation today?
Well, I am in the incredibly lucky position of working for a news organisation that doesn't have to make a profit. And for various reasons, because I chose badly, all the previous news organisations I've worked for have tended to make a thumping great loss. So nobody's met their duty. Of course, any commercial organisation has to survive, and that means making a profit. But no, our first duty is to try to tell the truth as we see it, and that means, you know, separating fake news from real news, false facts from real facts, but then trying to give an honest and accurate analysis of why what is happening, and that is often the most important bit of all.
Do you think Trump will be able to pay a state visit this year?
No, I don't think so. I think what Trump wants to do is he wants to arrive in this country and be welcomed, and he can do one of the two things, but probably not both.
Hi, Andrew. You're too modest to say that you had a byline on the first edition of The Independent, if I remember rightly.
I did, the very first paper,
I
yes.
think so. I think one of the things that I just wanted to ask was about the interview that was earlier this week with Eddie Mair and Boris Johnson. There was a lot in social media, as you were saying, just about this sort of fake news business, about the fact that the BBC didn't lead the news at 10 and didn't lead and say, well, look, you did this with Diane Abbott and led it because it was an election, but you didn't lead it, you didn't then lead this thing. How frustrating do you think, do people at the BBC find that type of...
Well, I find it very frustrating because, to be honest, it was an interview with the Foreign Secretary in which, asked about some of the details of the Tory programme, he stumbled and paused. Now, that's very interesting. He didn't do as well as he ought to have done, but it wasn't a kind of catastrophe. And after all, the BBC had it on the website, that we reported on virtually every programme. We showed clips of it ad nauseam. The idea that we were trying to suppress that interview was utterly absurd. And by the way, Eddie Mair, who has occasionally gone over the top slightly in his rudeness to politicians, on that occasion was absolutely right. All he was doing was asking Boris Johnson clear, factual questions about the Queen's speech, which Boris Johnson couldn't answer. I put it to you that there is nobody interested in politics in this country who doesn't know that story. I mean, it went out very, very widely.
Talking about car crash, I mean, was Diane Abbott the worst possible example of car crash interviews you've seen in recent times?
That was a particularly extraordinary interview. I do think possibly that because we now know she's got type 1 diabetes and she got it quite recently and is having some trouble with her diet, it may well be that it was genuinely a problem of illness and lack of ability to concentrate. Whatever you think of Diane Abbott, she's normally quite good on numbers. She's actually in the past...
With her eyes closed or without her eyes closed?
Either way, something odd happened in that interview and the one afterwards.
Say that again.
Do you think that media today actually manipulates by its presentation to sway people to think one way or the other? And if I may ask a second question, what are your future ambitions?
On the media thing, yes, of course, different bits of the media try and push people in different directions and always have done. There's nothing new about this. Papers of the right and of the left choose and skew news, and it's being done online as well. But it's an old, old story. And the answer is to make sure that as a consumer you consume different media and that you consume lots and lots of the BBC, I would say, by and large, because they're in the middle. As to my own ambitions, I've had my first exhibition of paintings. I'd like to have 2 or 3 more exhibitions of paintings and them to go well. I'd like to make another documentary series, and I'd like the Andrew Marr programme to carry on with Andrew Marr on it for quite a long time to come. I've got no further ambitions than that.
Go on.
Hi. In the 90s, you wrote or published a book called Ruling Britannia, I think.
That's
and
right.
it's a sort of lesser known amongst the other books in your canon. I was just wondering how you reflected on that now. I remember it being very critical but very insightful about Westminster. And I was just wondering if your views have changed or whether you still believe that it is fundamentally flawed.
Well, it's interesting because it's one of those books, as you say, it isn't much read now, but there's a lot of it that I certainly agree with. And I'm sure lots of it has aged badly as well. I was highly critical of the EU as it related to a parliamentary democracy then, which is interesting given that I'm seen as a kind of completely Europhile commentator since. But the thing that I was most struck by when I was writing that book was the accelerating nature of change and the difficulty of our constitution to grasp that, and also the odd way that we treat as it were, local government. So wherever you are in the country, your taxes are raised centrally, and they go to the Treasury, and then the Treasury doles back a little bit of money, which is then spent locally. We don't really have proper devolved spending, and I think I was arguing then that the great cities needed a much more direct democratic system so that Manchester could be run better, London could be run better. That's actually happened since then. The final thing I'd say, which I think is even more relevant now, is I compared the power of the big corporations with the power of national governments. If you look at the 5 largest companies in the world today, they're all the big 5 American tech companies based in California, and they are having a vast effect on how we move around, how we drive, how we shop, how we eat. They are deep, deep into our daily lives. And they are not paying their fair share of taxation, and democratic governments around the world which don't deal with those really, really big corporate players around the world are going to find that their actual secular power leaches away stage by stage. I think it's a really, really big challenge for everybody on the right and left of politics, which our government hasn't yet grappled with.
I was just keen to understand, how has your outlook on life changed since your stroke? Do you now seize the moment? Do you now sort of look to test and try out new passions, or is that more sort of investing and creating memories with your wife and family?
I'm a much kinder, gentler, more herbivorous feature as a result of the stroke. And when it comes to painting, I mean, I always wanted to paint in a kind of more vibrant, semi-abstract way, but I was always a bit scared that I wasn't good enough. And since the stroke, I just think, well, you know, life is short. Be well, get on with it. Pull your finger out and crack on. I guess that's the biggest change.
A sense of guilt?
No, not really. No, I would say no guilt.
Well, you did say once that your wife's father was deaf, and then she found that you had a stroke, and you must say that she must have the worst possible luck. And so it seems to me that that's a confession of slightly feeling guilty, and therefore you now treat your wife better?
I sincerely hope so. No, Jackie has been a wonderful carer. I've got a very, very caring family, and they have had a much harder time in many respects than I do. And one point I'd make about stroke and many other illnesses like it, it's very, very tough having a stroke, but it's in many ways even tougher to be married or to be the child of somebody having a stroke, because you then have to look after them in ways you didn't expect to, and you have to put your life on hold. And in a sense, as the sufferer, you're at the center of things, and ego takes over, but the people around you have a really rough time. It's true.
Hello. Has your technique for asking a tough question in an interview changed over your career compared to when you started out?
Yes, I used to say far too many words. I had very, very clever, thought-through philosophical questions which went on and on and on, and allowed the person being interviewed to work out what to say. About halfway through my question, I now ask shorter, sharper, clearer questions.
Binary questions.
Sometimes binary.
Yes. Go on, yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, when you were a fledgling Westminster reporter, how did you persuade MPs and influencers to talk to you instead of the established reporters and commentators? And if you were starting again today, would you do something different to that?
How do I use them? So in terms of building contacts?
Yeah, how did you contact building?
So this is a very difficult question, which I think all political commentators struggle with. On the one hand, if you want to know what's going on, you have to make friends with politicians, so they tell you things in confidence. When I was a young reporter starting out, for instance, the Thatcher government was in full force. I was a young, relatively obscure Scottish journalist. I needed somebody in the cabinet who would tell me what had happened in cabinet that week. And one of the people who did that for me was John Patton. And he became quite a friend, and you know, we dined together a lot and drank a lot of wine together. And in return, John told me what was really going on, and it was very, very good for my career. But then the moment came when John became Education Secretary and was not a good Education Secretary. And I wrote a column saying that he was a very poor Education Secretary, and he got into trouble. And he was terribly, terribly hurt. And rightly so. He said, but we're friends. I've helped you all this time, and now you've turned on me. And the trouble is, to be an honest political journalist, you have to have a certain amount of ice at your heart. You have to betray your contacts and betray your friends from time to time, and it's the nastiest part of the job. But if you don't, then you're being dishonest, and if you don't have the friends in the first place, then you're simply ignorant. So between ignorance and dishonesty, you have to betray people.
You have said openly, to be a good journalist, you have to be devious.
That's absolutely true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no sense of guilt.
Not really, because you get the stories out. I'll give you an example of being devious and how it worked. I don't know if you remember the 5 tests that Blair and Brown said they were setting before they would join the Euro. And the Treasury and Number 10 were arguing about what those tests were going to be. Everyone wanted to know what they were. At that point, it seemed likely we would join the Euro. And no one could get the story. So what I did was I phoned up Alistair Campbell in Number 10, and I said, I gather that one of your tests is about housing policy, and that's what the Treasury are briefing. And Alistair said, well, they're not getting that. And he gave me just a little bit of information. And so I then phoned the Treasury and said, well, Number 10 are briefing this. And over the course of the day, I just bounced their prejudices against each other until they were both convinced the other ones were briefing me and wanted to do defensive briefing. And between the two, I got the full 5 tests and broadcast them. That was a good example of, I think, perfectly legitimate journalistic misbehavior.
In pursuit of the truth.
In pursuit of the truth.
A simple question from me. How successful do you think Theresa May will be with her Brexit negotiations? Yes or no? With elaboration, please.
I don't think I can say yes or no on that.
You didn't ask a binary question.
How successful? So it's a gradient. My guess is that, first of all, the UK is going to have to agree to pay an eye-watering amount of money to the EU. Second of all, we're going to have to agree more obtrusive oversight of the rights of EU citizens in this country. And third, we're going to have some difficult agreement on the Irish border and the customs union, basically to allow goods to carry on. We'll do all of those things. They will cause an enormous amount of row at Westminster in the papers. The government will not fall because Tory MPs don't want an election yet. After that, I predict that we will get some kind of relatively successful friction-free trade agreement, some associate membership of or associate relationship with the single market that will prevent the complete collapse and the falling off the cliff that so many people hope. So I think it's going to be, I think we will probably get a slightly worse deal than we had inside the EU, and we'll pay through the nose for it, but worse things have happened.
I think on the Irish border, it's very simple. You tell the DUP that there will be no boundary, except for homosexuals, transgender, and so forth. They can't come across, and that will solve all the problems. But I don't understand one thing. Why can't Britain just say, we're gone? And then they'll say, well, how about the single market? Well, everything carries on, unless you want to put tariffs. What I don't understand is whenever people complain about the possibility of tariffs, they don't follow through with what necessarily comes about afterwards, namely retaliation. So it's very simple. If Britain say, okay, no tariffs, and the European Union say, yes, on cars, we're going to have 40% tariffs or 20% tariff, and so Britain will say, fine, we will do exactly the same. They import more Mercedes-Benzes than Britain sells Fords. So why can't they do that on a case-to-case basis?
Well, I think what you're suggesting there is that people are going to behave as economically rational actors. And I don't think we can assume that on either side. On the European side, there is a lot of hurt pride and genuine worry that this is the beginning of the breakup of the EU. These are people who have devoted their entire lives to keeping the EU together. And therefore, if they think the best way to hold the EU together is to punish Britain, that is what they will do, economic rationality aside. I think that is the danger. And therefore, the language that we use and they use matters very much indeed. It's very important, I think, that we say right at the beginning, we are not leaving Europe. We feel ourselves to be good Europeans. We just don't want in this country to be governed under the rules of the EU. We want to be an independent sovereign country. But we like you. We want to work with you. We want to trade with you. And that is the best approach.
Good evening. I know, I'm sorry. I'm not sure whether I understood properly that you said, did you say you have a website for your paintings? And then the second question is that you said you would have organized an exhibition already and you would like to have another one. I'm sure you must have a lot of galleries that must be lined up to exhibit your paintings.
Well, that's very, you haven't seen the paintings yet. Yes, it's the Nick
Half
Court.
have been sold. So
Half have been sold, yes,
It's
so
very
far.
popular.
So, yeah, it's the Nick Court Gallery in Liverpool. I wanted to go to Liverpool. I didn't want to do it in the middle of London. It's a bit too arrogant for my first show. And Liverpool has a great painting tradition.
Whoa. I hope that there are not too many whatever they call them themselves here. They think they're probably more important than you. The Tate is a very good gallery there. But there it is. Okay, about 1 minute.
What are your thoughts on the American students who just got released from North Korea? And what do you think of North Korea, more generally speaking?
Well, North Korea is possibly the most barbarous country on the planet. What we now know is that anybody who goes there from the West, for any purpose, journalism, tourism, or anything else, is taking a massive risk of being arrested. I just think they are beyond the pale. I do hope that eventually Beijing cracks down on them enough to get a change of regime, but it's a ghastly, ghastly situation. And it must, the possibility of war in the Korean Peninsula or around the Korean Peninsula must be the most dangerous hotspot in the world today, I would say.
I've been to North Korea twice. It's not dangerous at all. It's just extraordinarily odd. Basket case.
Which politician who you've worked with or interviewed do you have the most respect for, or have you had the most respect for, and why?
That's a difficult one. I have to go back quite a long way.
Winston Churchill.
Because I don't want to show any bias and so forth. I think probably the greatest politician I knew and interviewed, he's now no longer with us, was Denis Healey. That's a controversial choice to the extent that he was a very unpopular Chancellor of the Exchequer in the dog days of the Callaghan government. But he was the guy who more or less single-handedly wrenched the Labour Party's policy on economics round into a kind of sane direction, took on people from, he was being attacked by the right, by the trade unions, by the left, by everybody, and he was this extraordinarily dogged, tough individual who just saw the way forward and kept on going remorselessly. I also was very impressed by the fact that he had a great backstory, much more so than politicians do these days. He was a war hero, beachmaster at Anzio, a fantastic encyclopedic knowledge of poetry and English literature, one of the most interesting, enjoyable, witty people you could possibly sit across the table from. There aren't many left like that.
And he was a great admirer of detective stories, wasn't he?
He was. He was
the chairman of the Crime Writers Association, and introduced me to a trilogy of the best detective stories by, I can't remember his name now, sorry, but he was an extraordinary, and I think he was very good. Did you ever come across Enoch Powell?
I watched him speak. I didn't ever interview him.
Would you have liked to have interviewed him?
I'd have loved to have interviewed Enoch Powell.
For me, I think that he must have been the most intellectual politician of our age, or of the century.
But also, in many respects, very, very flawed. I got my degree at Cambridge, partly, but they do this thing where they give you, they call it practical criticism, and you get poetry or prose, and you have to rigorously analyze it. There's no indication of when or who wrote it or whatever. And you have to take it apart and put it back together again. And I got a bit of prose about Britain's relationship with Europe, beautifully argued, Latinate, full of quotes, clever, and fundamentally dishonest in its arguments. And I took it apart, and I said, it's brilliant, but it's dishonest. I think it was written by Enoch Powell, and it was.
That's why you got a first.
That's why I got a first, yeah.
Shortly, I think probably in the next few weeks, the BBC is going to be made to publish the salaries of its highly paid presenters. I just wondered how you and your colleagues feel about that, and also what it means for the BBC if it has to do that, but its commercial rivals don't.
Do you know how much he's paid?
Well, you will. No, I mean, it's uncomfortable for all of us. I mean, I'm well paid, but I'm much less well paid, as it were, or much less overpaid, perhaps, than people working for rival organisations who won't go through this process.
£580,000.
Not true. Less than that. Much less than that now.
Oh, really?
Much less than that,
Oh, well.
yes.
Let us shred this piece of Wikipedia. We were talking about it yesterday with Nick Sirota. I mean, you know, the director of Tate and Neil McGregor, director of the British Museum, one an OM, the other CH, they get paid only £168,000. So it's perhaps BBC is paying much more than they ought, or I don't know. But okay, very quickly, the hour is out. 3 quick questions.
In the recent book about the work of Gillian Ayres, you say that there's one of her paintings which you look at every day. Which one is it?
I'm trying to remember its name. It hangs in my kitchen. Jackie, can you remember the name? I can't remember the name. I honestly can't remember the name. It's a painting I acquired of hers a long time ago, and it's very bright, very colourful, very complex. And I walk down into the kitchen every day, and my heart lifts. It's possibly the most beautiful thing I own.
Your heart lifts. Why do you live in the bedroom? Why do you live in the kitchen?
I've got other Gillian Ayres in the bedroom. They're all over the house.
All right, quickly, 2 more quick questions.
In the light of Mrs. May's revelation about the wheat field, what's the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
What is the naughtiest thing I've ever done? I've certainly ingested various chemicals that I shouldn't have done when I was a young man, going to punk clubs in London in the early 1980s, and misbehaving very badly there. That's about as far as I'm going to go.
Last question.
Andrew, do you think that the politicians deserve the horrible bile that they get? I mean, for instance, Theresa May, she's a woman doing a perfectly good job, and there's Corbyn being slagged off. You know, even on the day of pre-election, the Today programme was saying she was the most popular politician and she had the highest ratings. The following day, she announced the election, and it was just totally strange. And you say, everyone says it was the social media that won Corbyn, but I think people are being very, very cruel to politicians in general. Do you think they deserve it?
It is a cruel, cruel world, politics, and to survive in it, you need an elephant's hide. What I would say is, in daily life, all of us make mistakes, or think one thing and do another, don't do quite as well as we should. Malign serendipity, if you like, happens to us. Things go wrong. And we kind of survive, and a few people who know us well think you could say you got that wrong. Politics is a bit like daily life put into a pressure cooker under huge, huge acceleration. If a drama is daily life on a stage taking place for 3 hours, but everything accelerated and made more intense, then politics is drama on steroids. And the people engaged in it make career-ending, catastrophic mistakes of the kind that all of us make in our daily lives on the stage and are destroyed by it. And in a sense, that is why it is so alluring, that is why it is such an addictive profession for a certain kind of person, and why it's so wonderful to watch. But it's a very, very brutal, very, very cruel world. And I think anyone going into politics now understands that.
Do you ever regret not being a politician?
I never regret not being a politician.
All right, well, look, I'm afraid that the hour is up. Will you please join me in thanking Andrew Marr for a fascinating hour?